Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. My name is Martha Rogers, and it's my pleasure to spend the next 30 minutes with you exploring today's topic, the topic of fear in our culture. You know, in the age of 9/11, Afghanistan, the Iraq War, financial collapse, Amber Alerts, mass shootings, some say that our society is defined by a culture of fear these days. So it's not surprising when you read statistics that 3 out of 4 Americans say they feel more fearful today than they did some 20 years ago. Are we living in exceptionally dangerous times? I can't believe that, because all crime statistics, especially in Linn County, say that crime is down. Yet I have a sense that panic and the public's response to crime or attack or lack of protection seems to be really sharp and heightened. There was a book I read recently, I reviewed it. It was by sociologist Barry Glassner. It was called The Culture of Fear, and he believes that it's our perception of danger that has increased, not the actual level of risk. Glassner says that people and organizations sometimes manipulate our perceptions and profit from fears. Advocacy groups that raise money by talking about fear of disease or microgerms, or politicians who talk about all the different types of crime and terrorism and drug use. It goes on in his book, and he says there is a price to pay for all this social panic. When I think about this, I think about 2 recent events that I myself have experienced, and one was this spring's Boston Marathon. I grew up near Boston, and I can never remember a time that all of Boston was shut down, yet millions upon millions of people all over the world were watching for an X-ray image of one man in a boat in a yard. Things have changed. Recently, there was an editorial, and I heard also on radio, on public radio, about a principal and a teacher who turned in and expelled a 6-year-old kindergartner for playing. What had he done? He had taken some clay, he had fashioned it, and he was pretending to shoot. He was kicked out of school, 6 years old. And I think the people who we should be afraid of more, in my opinion, is the principal and the teacher, who can't make wise judgments or can't make perceptions. And here's a quote I want to share from you from the principal. He said, "No shooting behavior, even in play, can be tolerated in this school. It will lead all our children into a path of terrorism and killing if this behavior is allowed to go on." Wow. That's the opening for today's show this morning. I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists today, because I grew up playing cowboys and Indians. I grew up shooting with clothespins, and I did not become a killer. So I've been wanting to explore fear. Let me introduce to you Jeff Tecklenburg from the Gazette on the opinion page, and Tim Hyatt representing the Islamic Center, Muslim Center today. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Welcome.
Good morning.
Welcome. I'll throw the first question right out at you. Do you think we're living in a culture of fear?
I'm afraid so. And unfortunately, that pun is intended, or not intended, but in any case, it's definitely something that we realize we live and are surrounded by real and unreal fears. And there are things such as phobias that are our personal insecurities. And so those are things that we individually understand and have issues with, whether it's a fear of flying, fear of spiders, and other nasty goblins in the night. But it's the ones that are more realistic in knowing where your next meal is going to come from and whether you're going to have this job next year. Are just a number of the real versus imagined type things that we're conditioned to worry about.
How about you, Jeff?
As you mentioned, I think there is a great overreaction, whether it's a culture of fear or what you want to describe. I think there is a tendency to overreact to a lot of things in our society today. As you mentioned, crime statistics, including murders and violent crime, is down by about half in the last 20 years. Most of the statistics tell you that, we don't have as much to fear as we sometimes fear. And I think you see this, we've run stories and articles about helicopter parents, for instance, who hover about their children, can't let them take risks, afraid they're going to get hurt every time they turn around. So they try to guide and hover over them every minute of the day, or they are in constant contact with teachers and everybody else just to make sure that their Johnny or their Susie is not going to be, overlooked or in danger somehow. So I think you see more of that, yes.
You mentioned that it's in our culture now, but I have to recall that FDR said back in 1933, with the Depression and everything else happening in the country, that there is nothing to fear but fear itself, and the fear paralyzes us. And I'm wondering if we're not experiencing some of those same emotions or responses. I'm thinking, Tim, and maybe you can address this, even with what happened with 9/11. All of a sudden there was a new fear of terrorism in the United States, which up to that point we really hadn't discussed about terrorism on our soil or even used the word terrorism. What kind of reactions did you feel, or some of your friends feel? When was that? In '01, when that happened?
Well, it was very real and yet surreal to see that on television, to see those images taking place on that day, and never mind who or why or what, but the fact that it was happening, and being a New Yorker myself, knowing that that was in my backyard and that those glorious landmarks had been destroyed, and then the carnage and the panic, and just imagining yourself in any of those situations, whether 1 mile, 5 miles, 10 miles away from that, everything was paralyzed, and it was absolutely chaos. No Hollywood movie can replicate that.
What do you think is contributing since that time? And I think it's, in my mind, it's been since those attacks and onward that my interest in fear has been piqued. What do you think is contributing in our society to some of these fears or some of these unknowns that we react to so strongly?
Well, I can start it off. I think there is a heightened sense of 24/7 news and information that comes to us. I think that's part of the situation. I mean, it's unprecedented, the number of sources and places you can get, almost instant updates on everything. But what happens, I think, a lot of that, especially on cable news, I think gets repeated over and over again during a day. It kind of drives that latest message home, even though it's relatively nothing new. You have that same message, that same description being pounded into your head, and that I think can lead to a distortion of how serious it is, a distortion of, okay, what is my real risk here, or is this a relatively rare event?
And does this even involve me?
Exactly, but there's so much constant coverage, and some of it good. I mean, and some of it is certainly worthy, and we need to do it. But it's that 24/7 pounding into our heads, I think, that really can take its toll on people's perceptions.
Well, I have to laugh. I'm so thankful for KCRG for hosting this program. But when we walk into the studio, the first words we see are "first alert," even just for the weather. It is becoming pervasive, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you want to be, the news industry wants to be first with things, but we should equally want to be accurate. And there's the struggle, and there's competition, and there's all kinds of outlets, and you have extreme agendas on the right and the left. So, sorting those things out is what we're supposed to try and do. So,
there's no doubt that news comes fast and furious, and so we know that it comes at a much faster rate than ever before. It's instantaneous. But I'd like to also have us all remember the definition of news. What is news? Today, anything is news. And if you separate the realities and worthwhile news versus sensationalism. So as Jeff said, cable news programs are going to forever perpetuate the same program night after night. It's like a soap opera where the storyline really hasn't changed because they stick to that topic and they don't change. And it's really unfortunate because sensationalism, whether it's the Daily News or the New York Post. It's a big picture, and it's a big byline or headline, and that's what's supposed to grab your attention. Now, what I could say for other media outlets, such as most newsprint, whether it's the Gazette or the Wall Street Journal, you're getting real news, you are getting articles, except for the editorial page or an opinion article. Those are biases, and that's okay, but they're relegated to a special spot in that edition. Whereas the cable news, they are free to do what they want, and that is their prerogative. And yet, what is drawing us? What is really drawing us? And why do we have that crazy interest in wanting to only hear the bad and continue to dredge it?
And that is a crazy interest. I even find myself fascinated with some stories. So I have to learn how to filter that I need to listen to this again, or I don't need to listen and I can turn a knob off, because it's all media. I can't cite one source, and my own father was a newspaper man for his whole career. So I want to honor the media at the same time that I understand their need to keep their revenues and all the situations going with their attention and headlines. But then what's the effect of all this? What are we teaching our children about fear? Are we teaching them to be pessimistic? Are we teaching them not to trust? Or what's the overall anxiousness that comes with it?
Well, I was doing some more research ahead of this show, and it seems to back up what one of my columnists that I run on Saturday. Her name is Lenora Skenazy.
I like her.
And she is very pragmatic about that children are overprotected and that we don't let them take risks, even in the big city like New York. It's not as dangerous, in most neighborhoods as you think it might be, or as the perception might be. There are studies that show that children that are constantly reined in aren't left to take risks, aren't left to have a little sense of adventure. Maybe they're going to skin their knee learning how to ride a bike or something. They become somewhat paranoid, or they become, very risk adverse, and they can develop some really serious problems about coping with the world. So.
And the real world out there that they'll grow up into is all about taking risks and trying things and learning from mistakes to get up and go again, isn't it?
It is. It's a certain amount of self-reliance we all have to learn. That doesn't mean we can't, help others or have others help us, but there's a healthy balance, I think, is what Lenore tries to say in her column, and warn folks about being overly protective. So.
And I don't think it's something that we're necessarily taught or teaching our children. It's becoming a natural conditioning. It is a fact of life, and we are told who is out there to protect us and the reasons why, whether it's the TSA, whether it's government surveillance, any of these sort of programs that tell us to be afraid of the person who looks different, who dresses differently, who's an immigrant. However, they're all contributing members of our societies, but there is that ingrained sense that you might have to look at somebody twice when you're at the airport, and it says, if you see something, say something. You see a lot going on, and I think airports are the most exciting place to be, because you see people from many cultures and dressed in different ways, and everyone's going to different places at the same time. It's fascinating, but I don't think I have to worry that much about what's in that bottle of water or what's in my shoe. But we are conditioned to do that, and it becomes the norm.
So in our search for protection, whether it's for children with parents or in public settings, our reactions based on fear or anxiety might be leading us to behavior that's not going to contribute to society much. It seems like in public places or with some parenting and family situations, we're pulling in more to ourselves with technology and whatever, rather than allowing the free exploration or talking to strangers or learning from other places.
Well, our governments too, and schools and lots of places have become very focused on security, making us safe 100% of the time. I mean, that's a nice goal. I don't think it's realistic, and I think it's overreaching at times.
Well, in a litigious society, I think everyone's worried about what they might be suited, and so they're afraid of what the ramifications are if you haven't taken every possible measure to protect it, whether it's putting school guards at the front of every elementary school. It becomes very extreme, and yet it's because people are afraid of what might happen, not so much to their societies, but from their legal perspective and their responsibilities.
So is it fear motivating these kinds of reactions, do you think, that not only because of potential lawsuits. But we don't want to let everything happen. We're anxious, we're afraid, so we try to overprotect, and then we go on the other end of the continuum. Is that something of the balance with fear in society and our culture?
I suppose it is to some degree. You know, litigiousness is certainly at a higher level than it used to be. The fear of terror, I think, is often overblown. The actual number of terrorism events we have in this country is very few. And to paint one culture, one religion, or anybody with that is another sign of our reaction to fear, overreaction to fear, I think. So, I don't know. Yeah.
I think I keep using the term define fear, define this, define that. But if we actually define what is terror, and in my opinion, anything that anyone does to anyone else to harm them is an act of terror. And it seems to have been defined in only one way, unfortunately, based on religion or race. But we all have to remember anything that is unpleasant and unfair and harmful to another is a terrorist act.
It produces terror.
And that causes fear. But it could be verbal, it could be mental, it could be any shape or form.
And in the schools, I think we call it bullying.
Correct.
Which is something we're teaching youth not to do. Yep. But withdrawing them from the schools or from the social situations isn't going to be an aid to future learning for our culture. And that's one of my fears. The fear about fear is that the after effect of this, we haven't really spent time to look at or to realize what we are conditioning kids to be this day. I like that word that you brought up, Tim, conditioning, rather than teaching. We're not overtly teaching them, but I grieve every time I go into a store and there's this cute little 3 or 4-year-old, and I used to teach 3 and 4-year-olds, and I just want to say hi, how are you? I want to see a smile. And they are already so conditioned to avoid a stranger, even at my age. And I'm a pastor in a church, and they don't know that, but it's that conditioning that concerns me.
Well, even here in Iowa, we do have occasionally a terrible event like the Evansdale cousins, and then from Dayton, the teenager who was kidnapped and killed. And those things, they're horrible things, and the media has to do a thorough job of covering those. And yet to live in Iowa is a pretty safe place. I grew up on a farm near a small town, and the worst thing ever happened to us was somebody stole gas out of my father's fuel tank, But it was, a leave your door open type of life, and I hate to see us lose that entirely. I hope it doesn't. As neighbors and communities, we have to be on the lookout for each other, to help each other, to protect against the rare occasions when something terrible like that can happen. We need to be smart about it, but to live in fear every day seems to be not very productive.
It doesn't mean that we can't take away lessons and learn from them so that we could avoid being complacent. A lot of people are used to it, not us, but to leave their front door unlocked. I can't even imagine that. And it's just, why invite a situation? We're in the backyard, I'm going to close my front door, and if we're in the front yard, we're going to lock our back door. I mean, it's a mode of protectionism, I guess, in a sense, and being pragmatic, realistic, and smart about it rather than complacent and then say, oh my, I should have thought of that afterwards in hindsight.
And that's one of the, I guess, behaviors in a way that lock us again within ourselves. And what you said about serving others and reaching out to others and to the community and getting to know each other is the way that maybe we can address some of these anxieties and fears. Do you think our society as a culture can live in fear? Can a society, can Linn County be in fear of certain things? I know the flood was something that was very real and can produce very real tensions and fears. But you hear about gun control, and you hear about all these other threats to protecting our individualism in our society. And I wonder, is it an individual response? Is it a cultural response? Is it both? What might your thoughts be on that?
I think it's a community action that has to happen in some of those circumstances, and I think that's an example of learning from a previous situation where we had the horrific flood in 2008, and we were very close to having a repeat, but people knew how to react and how to take care of things, be proactive, and having learned from it. There may have been some fear, but I think people were so concerned with taking corrective measures and actions that they didn't have time for fear. They just knew it was time for action, not to react and cry and scream and run and panic. It was time to take action. It was a joint effort. So,
and some of that's that open door policy you're saying of neighbor helping neighbor and being.
I think there's still a pretty strong community sense in this area that I can see. I mean, after the flood, there were countless examples of people, helping others and just pouring out, the saving the city wells, the helping over at the hospital, helping individual neighbors. I think, we ran many, many stories, and there are probably many more stories that we could have run about that, to be honest. So it was still a lot of community sense there, and that's good to see.
Well, with the flood, again, that's a realistic threat. But what do you think some of these cultural fears that we're seeing with the helicopter parents or reactions to other situations, what's the enemy? What are we afraid of? Is it a loss? Is it not being able to protect and provide? Is it a combination of major things, which it usually is, but what do you think might be some of the sense we're feeling right now about what the enemy might be or what the perceived threat might be?
Well, we could throw out more adages such as we are our own worst enemy, or Walter Kelly, the cartoonist in 1970, when he said, we have met the enemy and the enemy is us, or he is us. We have to look at ourselves as being responsible for what we've created, but on another side of it, I'm not sure how we would really consider that.
It's a very difficult question. I mean, if you get a culture drifting one way, how do you turn it around? In the media, we would say more education, more information, in context, thoughtful discussions, civil discussions, and try to promote that. And at the same time, there are certain elements of the media that don't. The entertainment media is all over the board on a lot of things, and there's a lot of things I don't watch or wouldn't let my kids watch today. And there always have been some of that, but it's probably maybe as challenging a time to be a parent as it ever has been, I would say. And I've been a parent myself, so it's a more complicated world, but we still need people who are critical thinkers, who can sort this out, challenge what they see and hear.
Take risks,
right, and we need,
build relationships.
Right, and we need media who, promote understanding, full context, discussions of issues in depth and not knee-jerk types of reactions too.
I see the Gazette trying to do that with holding conversations and trying to get more people involved in what should be covered and how it should be approached. And I think that's that relationship building that will help ease some anxiousness rather than just being told all the time and reporting.
Our industry's in a transition thing, and we at the Gazette, I know our company, KCRJ, we're trying to value more that community discussion and try to further that on issues like this that are difficult ones, but ones where you need a community discussion. So.
You touched on the topic of parenting, and we want to give as much guidance as possible to our children, and sometimes it is unavoidable to have that sense of helicoptering where you really want to control as much as you can. You want to ensure their success. You don't want to see them fail. You want them to marry the right people. You want them to have the same values you grew up with, and ultimately they'll be conditioned or do their own thing, and we have to stand back and let them develop just like the rest of society, but we can't let it be to the point where there's no controls either. There are rules. If you live in my house, you're going to follow these rules, and otherwise you take your own responsibility.
And I think kids thrive, or families thrive, people thrive on boundary setting, that they have some security and protection. And I think that's a natural instinct in some of the fear that we've had. It's an instinct to protect and provide, and we want to do the best we can with that at all times. Which then I turn to, how can we contribute back to society? How can we build those relationships? How can we stop discriminating and lumping one class of people or race or culture responsible for one act and not exaggerate the effect that maybe a person from a certain race or culture has had? It's getting to know the person. It's getting to contribute back
Dialogue, open hearts, open minds, open ears, that's how you start. I mean, if you want to engage, engage. Otherwise, don't stand back, complain, and not know why politicians were elected or why certain rules, because you stood back and you didn't want to get involved. So there is that expectation. You do have to be engaged. You can't just ignore it.
Yeah, and it's an attitude. And it's also not letting politicians or other leaders try to scare you into accepting a policy or a new law. I mean, you got to step back and look and say, what is the real purpose behind this proposal?
And what are the facts?
And what are the facts?
What are the
of course,
facts,
what do they support? Or are they just trying to play upon my fears? Or is this an intelligent piece of legislation that we can, look at?
And that's where I think hope can step in and optimism can step in. When we think things through critically, when we look at facts, we build those relationships and we just don't go with what we've been fed.
How about if we contrast the fear with what makes us happy? What makes us happy? What do we want to do that we know we can control? And having faith, whatever your religion or background is, that if you have that sense of self-confidence, love and support of others, and you will know that this is what I want to do and it's what makes me happy, we'll stop focusing so much on the bad things, perhaps.
Sense of community, sense of family are just irreplaceable, I think,
and aren't we
overcoming
lucky
these fears and focusing on the happier place.
And aren't we lucky to live in Iowa where sense of family and sense of values and sense of worth are all purposeful values in our lives and are respected?
Certainly. I had a daughter who went to school out in New York, though, and I tell you, she found that sense out there too. So
Good.
we shouldn't stereotype New York City, should we?
No, we better not.
No, we'll get the accents going though for you. Well, frightened citizens, according to the book I read a while ago, are said to make better consumers and more easily swayed voters. And I hope as individuals we can rise above those goals and make up some good decisions based on fact rather than just on fear. Another book I read in my conclusion, to quote, is a book called We Are All in Shock. Stephanie Mines wrote that book, and she says that the challenges and anxieties of today's lifestyle, being in shock, is typical to many of our families. And she says this can be managed. And that's the challenge I would like to conclude with today. We've talked about awareness, relationship building, learning how to become an inner observer, a thinker for ourselves instead of reacting with fear just to outside events is a way we can start to manage anxieties in our families, in our society. But I also have to ask that, shouldn't we combine this with our faith journeys? Our faith teaches us to have hope instead of fear. What are we really afraid of? All religions say, do not be afraid, but that's easier said than done. I can't help but wonder, what will your contribution be towards healing and towards producing hope and optimism in a culture full of fear? We could continue and live as we are. We could increase fear, but I think none of us really wants that. Real or imagined, terror, dread, panic, anxiety are things that can protect us if we don't let them get the best of us. This has been a panel presentation by the Linn County Interreligious Council. On behalf of the Council and KCRG, I thank you for being with us. We look for you to come back and join us next week. See you then.